Welcome, folks. I'm really happy to have such a diverse audience here with us today. Today, our webinar is co-sponsored by the Nature Conservancy's Landfire program. We had a Landfire webinar last year with Randy Swati, and we decided it was such a success that we should bring Nature Conservancy back in to have another go at it this year. So this is going to be an interactive webinar. Henry has positioned a couple of polls throughout his talk, and we also have a poll at the very end of our webinar that will help us sort of evaluate how we're doing as our Learn at Lunch webinar series continues, and it also helps us understand if there's more than one person watching from your computer at a time. So if you wouldn't mind sticking around to participate in that poll, we'd really appreciate it. One more thing about continuing education credits. If you open your chat pod and look for my name in there, you'll see that I have entered some information about how to receive SAF or ISA CEUs. You'll need to fill out the Google form at that website or just at that link. So feel free to do that really quickly right now if you need CEUs, so you can give your full attention to Henry. So thanks a lot, Henry, for joining us today. Henry Bastian is a natural resource manager in the DOI Office of Wildland Fire in Boise, Idaho. Prior to this, he worked in Washington, D.C. on the implementation of wildland fire performance measures and reporting through the DOI strategic plan, budget, chair of the Woody Biomass Utilization Group, and Emergency Management Coordinator, Emergency Support Functions, and the National Response Framework. Not a busy person at all, I don't think. Henry is a graduate of Snow College and Utah State University. I'm very thrilled that he was willing to give this talk today, and I'm excited to welcome him digitally back to his alma mater, USU. So thanks, Henry. I'm going to hand it over to you, and again, like Mark said, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A pod on your screen, and I'll do my best to sort of sprinkle in those questions as they work for Henry, and then we'll follow up at the very end with the rest of the questions that don't get answered throughout the webinar.
I think we've got one poll that we want to start with, Mark, so if you can flash that poll up, we'll do this first poll right here at the very beginning, and
okay. So I've launched that poll now, folks. You should see that. If you'll go ahead and there are 3 questions there. You'll need to enter an answer for all 3 before you can submit. And so we'll just take about 20 seconds maybe and give folks a chance to answer there. And then I'll share those results at the end just so others can see what others' responses were.
So while you're waiting, and you're filling out that poll, I'm glad to be here. I do hail from Utah State University, so I'm actually excited to come back and do a presentation with USU. The picture that you see here on the screen is, of course, of Zion National Park. I spent 7 years working at Zion. It's a beautiful place. For those of you that have been there, you can know and appreciate that. And those of you that have not, I encourage you to go check it out. It's amazing. Of course, people often say, well, why did you leave Zion to go to DC? Well, I traded beautiful Navajo sandstone towers for granite towers, I guess. So sometimes that's what life, does. You just take different courses. All right. So let's go ahead and get started then. Do you have something, Mark?
So yeah, I'll share. I'm going to share the results. Can you see those?
Yep.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to do another poll here, but first, before we do this next poll, many of you probably like Dilbert or have seen Dilbert cartoons in the past, and this is a modified Dilbert. One of my friends and colleagues in the Fish and Wildlife Service modified this, and of course, at the time, I was just working on Landfire. Little did I know that I'd be also working on what is called our National Fire Plan Operations and Reporting System, NFPORS. So, sometimes as we look at data and things like that, it's not going to be 100% perfect, but hopefully in a little bit of humor, we can appreciate what we have. And then just in the lower left, one of the big things that we talked about in Landfire was, are we on time? And then this next graphic you see here over here on the right is, a lot of people sometimes just think Landfire, it's a fire data set. So let's do this next poll, Mark. Well, we got a little touch of it out west here. There's snow in the mountains, so I thought,
So
hey,
did
what an
we.
appropriate question. Let's
Yeah.
see how many are ready, you know? Maybe you want to hit the slopes.
Yeah. All right, I'm in that, and then I'm sharing those results now.
Awesome. Everybody's ready for winter. I love it. That's great. And looks like a good mix of people that are using and have had experience. So that's good. So let's move along, because that's not really why you came here, is to fill out polls. So we're going to talk about Landfire. It's the official title is the Landscape Fire and Resource Management Planning Tools Project. And like the last slide, I think a lot of people, when you hear the word Landfire, you kind of immediately think, oh, that's fire. I don't need to pay attention to it. But hopefully through what we're going to talk about here today, you'll be able to see that there's a lot more than just fire as part of this data set. So a little bit in the background of the need. You know, we're all familiar with the '88 fire season with Yellowstone, more fire like that in the 90s up to 2000, a big year. And that resulted in the National Fire Plan that then spurred a lot of other things. And the Government Accountability Office did a number of reports that talked about needing better data, better information. And they did a review, and they said, based on what they saw at the time, Landfire looked like it would be able to help you know, do a lot of this. And of course, one of the big data sets at the time was what is called fire regime condition class. And this is an overlay showing that data set with some of the fires in 2002. To jump right into it, Landfire includes both spatial and non-spatial products. So here you can kind of see the various types of products that Landfire produces, from vegetation to fire regime groups, as well as some of the fire products of the Anderson 13 fire behavior field models. But kind of the key thing here is it's more than just fire when you start looking at it. Well, people are interested in canopy height. They're interested in, you know, what is the vegetation cover and the vegetation type. And of course, from fire standpoint, we need those data just like everybody else to, you know, get these end products. What's on that landscape matters, and being able to correctly classify it is important. So these data are for all lands. Both private, public, all lands are mapped regardless of ownership, and we've also recently added the insular areas to the list. Part of the big success that I kind of always highlight is the partnerships and the collaboration that we have with Landfire. And of course, this started with the forest inventory analysis. We signed a memorandum of understanding in the early years, back in 2005. We have since updated that in 2009 and 14. We've just recently signed a collaborative partnership with the Gap Analysis Program. You know, the analogy that I used there is, I think Gap saw this speeding bullet train of Landfire come out, map all lands, didn't have to deal with re-gap and all these things at the same geospatial resolution using the same legend, and they said, there's an opportunity here. So we are collaborating and working together, and actually the next generation products are going to be a collaborative effort between Gap and Landfire. And then you can see there's a whole host of other ones. Bureau of Land Management with their assessment, inventory, and monitoring. Another big one is NRCS, the Natural Resource Inventory data. Very big data set that we did not have an advantage of when we did Landfire National. And then, of course, a host of other data sets. But that's really, I think, when you think about data, you need to build upon the good work of others and use that. It really strengthens the products in the end because of, you know, the good work that people have done. This graphic I'd like to highlight just because, you know, it kind of shows where we get the data from, but then also who are some of those data consumers. And this one, you know, kind of came from watching March Madness with basketball. Looked at the brackets and, you know, getting into the Final Four and thought, there's a fun way that we can do that with Landfire. And so similarly, we show here on the left, who are the data providers for Landfire, and then, you know, who are the consumers. And we're actually going to go into a little bit more of these consumers and how these data, you know, are foundational for a number of things here a little bit later. This one, I don't want you to spend a lot, you know, PowerPoint 101 says don't put up small details. But I just want you to know the takeaway message from this slide is there's a lot of data that go into the creation and the development of the Landfire products. And similarly with all of the outputs and the products that are available, there's a number of data sets that contribute to the creation of these data. And that's really the takeaway with this slide. So we're going to talk just a little bit about kind of this really simplistic approach of how these products are created. So we use Landsat Imagery. We use a number of environmental gradients, and we live and die by ground reference data, field plot data, on both points and polygon. And all of that data goes to contribute to development of our existing vegetation type, cover, and height maps. As part of the Landsat data, under Landfire National, we looked at getting 3 cloud-free days per pixel. And as we're looking now with the launch of Landsat 8, it's proving to be very good. So we're really excited with the combination of new remote sensed imagery and the addition of new plot data that I think is really going to be helpful as we look towards the future. To dive a little bit deeper into some of those environmental gradients, we look at climate information, ecological, topography, soil, biogeochemical data sets to help parameterize where does that vegetation exist, because we don't have plots, everywhere across the country. So you definitely need other data sets like this to help parameterize where these vegetation types exist, and it also helps us with furthering the classification of fire data information for the fire and fuels folks. As I talked about earlier, kind of living and dying by the plot, this is just a graphic showing the number of points and polygons, the distribution of where we get that data, and some simplified maps. There's some of the data like FIA that's sensitive, so we can't show those locations, but there's just a wealth of information out there that has really helped strengthen Landfire. There's some areas where we don't have data. And so, this is also my time in sales pitch that if you are aware of data that Landfire could take advantage of, please let us know, because we definitely like to use it. It's extremely helpful. With the Landfire, we talked a little bit earlier about the classification that GAP used, ecological systems, and Landfire has been mapping to that legend. But as we look to the future, the National Vegetation Classification Standard, NVCS, has been published by the Federal Geographic Data Committee, and so Landfire is moving towards that mapping standard. Our plans for the future are to map at the mid-levels of that hierarchy. And when you think about classification, the scale at the top, we look at land cover as a whole, going to cover type, giving it some definition with these, group or macro group names and the descriptions with those. Ecological systems kind of falls in there, and of course will result in an updated GAP Landfire on existing vegetation type. With that, it's important to know though that we augment, the legend with life form, leaf form, whether it's semi-natural vegetation or cultural type vegetation, because we realize that some vegetation types, have culturally been modified. So there's a number of things that are taken into account to ensure that we're mapping the landscape. Now I know Lisa Bai is on here from New Mexico, and so she's highlighted a concern for us in Landfire to say, yes, there have been some changes, with vegetation such as, introduced. We see that particularly in the West with crested wheatgrass, but that particular species, in the case in point, is an example of where maybe it's functioning the way we want it to in that kind of landscape natural state. It may not be the right mix of native species that used to be there, but it's a lot better than the alternative with cheatgrass or other types of brome. So things like that, we need to work through it and think about how does this map out on the landscape and what does that mean to our end users. We like to kind of show this slide. Some of you may have seen it before, but Landfire, it's getting faster, it's getting cheaper. When we started in 2010, for all 50 states, at that number of acres, it's only 2 cents an acre when you think about it. And in comparison, look at Louisiana and Alaska, the purchases. We got a really good buy when you think about all lands, all ownerships across the United States. So it's data for all. Another key point that I want to make with this is Landfire does not just generate data and say, hey, good luck with it, here you go. We also do some accuracy and agreement assessments. Actually, Jim Smith with the Nature Conservancy is a key player in helping us generate these analyses and these assessments. And so we want to help the user community have a sense, based on the number of plot data that we have, the number of variables that go into creating these Landfire products, what is the agreement that we were seeing in our products? So, here in this particular example with this Edwards Plateau Limestone Savanna Woodland, the row agreement, we use some confusion matrices to line things up, 66% of that lined up. So, you can take the agreement assessments that Landfire has produced, look at that, compare it with the application that you're intending to, apply these products, and make a determination on whether this best meets your needs. And that's kind of a key thing that I think people need to realize is any data set, regardless of what it is, it's not going to be perfect. You need to take a look at it, understand how it was generated and how it can either help you in accomplishing what you need to, or maybe you need to make some modifications to it to make it work for your area. And we also have some other presentations, webinars on that, and information on what you can do to modify the data. A big part of Landfire is looking to the future of this monitoring changes over time. And so just a graphic here to show you that we are really interested in where activities of change are occurring, what's going on in the landscape, being able to characterize that. We also apply severity. So what you see here on the screen is showing you the degree of change within these polygons. And that's a very, very important data set. We use the monitoring trends and burn severity data. There's other data sets like that with bark and ravage that we tap into. And where we get it from practitioners and others, we'll also say, well, what was the magnitude of change or severity that resulted from, say, this thinning or prescribed fire? If that data is there, that's really helpful in us then updating the vegetation type, cover, and height based on how severe those types of treatments or activities were. Transitioning a little bit, and this is where I want to spend maybe a little bit more time. We will want to take some time, of course, at the end for any questions that you have, and I'm not seeing any questions at this point in time. But applications, as Landfire started back in 2004, this is a graphic showing, and I really want to do a shout out to Randy Swati with the Nature Conservancy. He's really helpful. He's on the webinar today, but helping us with kind of tracking the number of times Landfire has been cited or referenced in a paper report in Google Scholar. And so you can see that, since its beginning, there's been a great increase in the number of applications that it's being applied. So we look here at 2016, of course it's 2017, we're kind of estimating, but all we see is this, upward and onward trajectory, which we're excited about. To help people start to think about these applications, this, what we call WHAM, Web Hosted Applications Map, the Nature Conservancy has been really helpful in pulling this together, is a way that people can go in, and we take from that Google Scholar list a few examples, but we will then populate this map and highlight where are Landfire data being used, how are they being used, and give tips and ideas on others of ways that you may want to consider using these products. And there's some short little summaries that are available. So I'd encourage you to go take a look, check this out, and then you may learn ways of applying the data that you hadn't thought of that could be really beneficial and helpful to you. So as we segue to this section, kind of the applications, particularly this foundation, and that's really what Landfire is. I've often joked with our team, it'd be nice to be able to have some kind of a watermark, on these products that would say "powered by Landfire," but we don't do that. You don't see that in the data, and so sometimes data is just this unseen partner in analyses and assessments, things like that. That it's there, and you don't realize the power and the potential that it has behind it until you actually start to drill down and look at, well, how did we get this map, or how did we get this assessment analysis? Well, there's underlying data like Landfire that provides this suite of vegetation characteristics and attributes, and gives you fire information that then ties into studies like we see here on the screen. And so a couple examples. Here on the left, this is an example through the Bureau of Land Management. They did a number of these ecoregional assessments, and particularly looking at a solar mitigation project where they could place solar projects. And what were in the underlying data? Well, Landfire. It really helped them look at the vegetation types, the BLM manages, and making a determination on where they should place these types of things. Similarly, this was a study early on. We were surprised out of Cal Berkeley. They started to look at pollinators, and we've all heard the demise of pollinators and what has happened with bees and diseases and things like that. Well, they wanted to see what the interaction was between bee pollination with natural vegetation versus human managed. And so they used Landfire data to look at bee populations in relationship to the landscape. So really, nice publication that goes into a lot more detail. And then here on the lower right, bighorn sheep, there was a viability analysis done on the Payette National Forest because they were concerned about disease interactions with local sheep, and they started to look at that in relationship to where the sheep grazed and the habitat for bighorn sheep. And again, Landfire was extremely valuable in helping look at the type and availability of habitat, and then the interaction of where those disease vectors could come from. Moving to some others, one that's been in the news, particularly for the Department of the Interior in recent years, is, of course, Sagegrouse. And USGS has done quite a bit of science through the Snake River Field Office, looking at how to help manage for this particular species. And one of the data sets, of course, that they turned to was Landfire with their vegetation type and biophysical settings. And the key thing about this that's really helpful is Landfire provides that base, but it is updated on a biennial basis so that you're able to see where these changes occur. And we use simple, consistent, repeatable measures so that over time you're able to look at what happens with habitat fragmentation, the effects on species distribution. So again, that underlying data is very, very important. But you don't see it on the maps. Powered by Landfire, it's just not there. Turning a little bit to fire, because fire's in the title, right? But it's not just all about fire. We talked about a number of examples where it's been used in the land side of the house. Within fire, one of the big questions that we deal with is what is the burn probability, that a particular location, may have. And of course, this is a combination of data sets. But having these landscape data showing you, again, the cover, the height of the vegetation related to fire characteristics is really important when we look at, where lightning exists, where human-caused fire incidents are. And based on, all of those types of data coming together, these types of data are produced with the burn probability maps. I'm looking here, I see some questions, so I think I'm going to take a pause here and go to Carrie and, well, they're both Carrie. Let's go to Carrie's questions. So I'm going to answer this one live. And do I click that button? I don't know, Megan, if I need to click that or not.
You just don't worry about it. Don't click anything. I'll take care of it once you.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Carrie said, is Landfire going to connect with NRCS soils ecological site descriptions? The United States Forest Service are looking at ecological site descriptions as well. Great question. So part of the underlying data that Landfire uses is NRSC soils. We use StatsGo, SurGo as part of the input data. Ecological site descriptions, we have been working with Joel Brown out of New Mexico to try to do some greater coordination because we think that there's a great opportunity to relate ESDs with biophysical settings. So we've done some initial prototyping with NRCS folks. We haven't been able to get fully our schedules aligned with NRCS at this point in time, but we see, I think, great value in looking at those types of state and transition models. There has been a paper that did a comparison between ESDs and biophysical settings, so if you're interested in that, please let us know. We can kind of point you in that direction. But we look at that as a way to path forward. And then I guess just a clarification connecting with Landfire. I think that answered it, Carrie. If not, come back and we'll follow up on that one. Next question. I think this is a good time for questions, so we'll just pause here. Jake's asking, what is the resolution in Maine? Different information likely will have different resolutions, but how far can you drill down to local tracks? So Landfire is based on a 30-meter spatial grid. That's based on the Landsat Imagery. There are some locations where we are using higher resolution imagery to help inform landscape vegetation. So particularly, an example that I'll highlight is in the western United States, there's a number of different sagebrush types. And so teasing out which sagebrush you're dealing with sometimes just cannot be done simply along with 30-meter data and a small sampling of field plot data. So we augment that, and we're working with the National Land Cover Data program to help improve the mapping of the unique sagebrush types. So specifically to Maine, to your question, it's 30-meter data. It is intended to be a regional to national data set. That's what Landfire has always communicated. So we caution you about drilling down too far, because the integrity of the data starts to break up, but we do find a lot of people doing it, and in some places they've found it to be very useful. But there's, the other analogy that I like to use with Landfire is it's kind of like this big net that's a catch-all. We realize that there's some organizations, groups, agencies, etc., across the country that have better data, and you've got the money to do that. Well, we also realize there's a number of agencies, groups that don't have data, and so this is kind of the great equalizer of helping provide a national landscape, view set of data that all can use and all can take advantage of, regardless of your situation. So just to follow up on Jake's then, just be careful. Again, that's why we do the agreement assessments and working with things. Let's go to Carrie. She says she's interested in that paper, so we'll do some follow-up with you later, Carrie, on that. Craig has asked, related question, are there any concerns about aggregating EBT into class, such as closed canopy, evergreen, open canopy, deciduous, etc.? Great question, Craig. Relative to aggregating data, we see people do that quite often. I don't think there's, the concern would be when you look at, again, lumping or splitting, of which direction do you always go with that. But I think if you go about it in a methodical, thoughtful process, you shouldn't have any concerns about aggregating, because the more that you aggregate up the agreement assessment data that Landfire has done. For instance, let's take ponderosa pine. You'll see in the Landfire legend, the ecological systems, that there's a number of different ponderosa pine types, and we will see people often just say, hey, it's all ponderosa pine, let's just lump all of these together. And we've found that when they do that, they see similar quality, some cases improved quality, by doing that, that aggregation. So hopefully that answered your question. Since we're still seeing a few questions, I'm looking at the clock. Still have some time, so I think we'll at least click off these next two and then we'll move on. So we're going to get Helen and Glenn's questions. So Helen asked, what is the program access path to the accuracy agreement assessments? So if you go to the website, landfire.gov, Helen, let me see, maybe I can even pull it up and we'll just quickly show it, here on the screen for you. Under data, you will then be able to find a location that says quality. And once you get under that section of the website, you'll then be able to see, let me pull it over here really quick. So right here, like I was saying, go to data products, come down to data quality, and from here, you'll be able to go in and look at the various versions that Landfire has done and then be able to pull up those agreement assessments. So hopefully that helps answer your question. If not, you can come back. And then let's go to Glenn's question. Is there a similar system to Landfire available in Canada? The answer to that is yes. Not as extensive as what we have down here in the United States, And we've actually been working with folks in Canada because just like we saw here in the United States, we've mapped all lands regardless of ownership. And when we think about fire, we think about wildlife, we think about other landscape things, those are not a respecter of boundaries. They don't care that there's this line drawn between Canada and the United States. And so we've been working with folks in Canada to extend the buffer, the range products are available on that side of the line, as well as what they can see here in the States. And we're hopeful that through those types of coordinated efforts that we may be able to expand and do something broader. But at least this point in time, there's nothing else available. If I didn't fully answer that question, Glenn, let me know. But I think we'll consider that one done for now.
Henry,
So,
let me interrupt you real quick. Randy put in the chat pod a message to Jake about the maps in Maine. So I would just like to bring Jake's attention to Randy's message in the chat pod. So move on. Go for it. Thank you.
So as I was talking about here with burn probability, it's very important when we start looking at risk. That's one of the big, I think, buzzwords that we're dealing with, particularly in wildland fire at this point in time is, well, what is the risk of these types of fires? And of course, it's all based on, well, what's the probability that you'll even have a fire on this given landscape? So a very important data set when we start to look at values that may be at risk and the threat of fire to those values. Next, another map is looking at fire potential. A little bit different from the probability. So again, using Landfire data, we're looking at, well, what is that potential that fire would be there, and then based on that relative potential for that wildfire to occur, how difficult would it be to deal with that fire based on past fires. So again, another important data set when we look at wildland fire. So drilling down a little bit, since I'm in Idaho, I'm going to use this example back from 2014. This was the Johnson Bar Fire in northern Idaho. And one of the big data IT applications that we use is called Wildland Fire Decision Support, or also known as WFDS. And in WFDS, they use these data using some spread models, and we'll dive into this here in the next couple of slides, of looking at the spread of the fire across the landscape. And here's just a big shout out to Joe Hudson, from the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, that just said, hey, we tried a number of things. We can catch the fire. We were worried about values at risk in our area. And using WFDS with the underlying Landfire data, it gave them some good information about what they could expect to see based on the fuels, the vegetation on the ground, and then, of course, the weather that they were experiencing. So very important when looking at managing landscape, you've got to have this foundational data to support it. Transitioning to WFDS, this is just showing you some examples of that, looking at fires. And what we do using this fire spread probability analysis, there's also near-term and short-term analyses and assessments, but we'll give a spread growth rate prediction to say, well, what's the probability that the fire will reach this location on the landscape, given the input data, both the land fire, topography, weather. And it's real for line off so you think about hey, what decisions do we make? A previous count with the Forest Service, Dan Crittenden, came up through the ranks, was a firefighter, and so he'd been out helping with hell attack, and he was talking to the forest supervisor and talking about, well, how did things go? How was the decision process? And he just, kind of in passing said, so do you use Landfire? Oh, he said, oh, we don't use that. We have no need for it. Yet all the maps that he was looking at was based on Landfire. So again, sometimes people don't see what's behind the scenes, and being able to understand that these data are important. They're really valuable in helping provide that foundation so you can inform the decisions that you're making. Another example, another incident commander, Tim Sexton, well known within the fire community. This one's from a little bit older. This is just as Landfire was starting, but back in 2005, Tim, well, I'll call Tim maybe one of the progressive incident commanders, because he understood, the value of data, modeling and things like that. And, he said, you can see it here on the screen, but it saved millions of dollars based on Landfire data because they were able to, again, look at what was the projected spread and the predictions with that. And it really helped him as an incident commander make some different choices relative to the resources that he was managing and where to put those resources. So again, you've got to look at these data, work with them. A lot of the folks within the Wildland Fire decision support system don't just take it out of the box. We have what are called fire behavior analysts and long-term analysts. They'll go in, sometimes they'll edit and tweak the data based on what's maybe changed with the data given other fires or treatments that have occurred that Landfire hasn't been able to update. That's one of the most common ways that they deal with it. But routinely people are taking a look at the data before they just open it up and use it out of the box. And it's really important to make sure that it represents the conditions and the landscape that you're dealing with. A new kid on the block, this is called the Interagency Fuels Treatment Decision Support System. And for those of you that are not in fire, probably kind of smiling, thinking, gosh, fire sure loves their acronyms. And we do. It's probably no different than a lot of other places. So IFTDIS is a new application that is intended to bring together a myriad of applications. The Joint Fire Science Program started this with a beta application to do the proof of concept of being able to do it. But what this is intended to do is to bring in a number of different models, put it in a landscape base to allow managers to work through, as you see down here on the lower right, this landscape evaluation, some strategic planning to implement their planning, to monitor, and then report. And this example that you see here on the slide is looking at a program called FlamMap, which uses Landfire data to predict what are the flame lengths and fire characteristics that you might see on your landscape that you are managing. So data set or models like FlamMap are being integrated. We're currently working on a new one called Fuels Treatment Effectiveness Monitoring, also known as FTEM, and that will be coming out shortly in IFTDIS. And many of you are probably familiar with the cohesive strategy. Again, a national scale effort to highlight goals to help us be better at managing fires with resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, and of course safe and effective wildfire response. But again, the underlying data that were used as part of that cohesive strategy, and I've just circled a few here, looking at the vegetation, the fire regime groups, helped inform maps like this one, looking at landscape classes, so that managers could do a better job of looking at not only their county but adjacent counties and working on these three goals of the cohesive strategy. And then drilling down into it a few more, there were a number of products that were produced as part of that that are available as part of the National Cohesive Strategy. This map here in the upper left just shows you some national priorities for broad-scale fuels management and where you may be able to do that. Map 4, again, just another example of a few others that are in there. Again, based on Landfire data, but the intersection of large, long duration wildfire potential and the opportunities for managing fires for resource objectives. And again, the fire regime group looking at the distribution of where those fires were relative to the severity and what managers can kind of plan and predict for. And then last but not least here in the lower right, prescribed fire use, where managers, currently use fire to manage, the landscape, and in the green, and then B and C are areas where you could consider or potentially, use more prescribed fire. So it's time for another poll. So going back to Dilbert and our clock, let's throw up the poll there, Mark.
All righty, and this is, just so we're clear, this is how satisfied are you with Landfire?
You bet.
Data, okay. So I'm launching that now.
At least for those of you that are familiar. We saw in the first poll that some of you hadn't, this is maybe your first experience and exposure to it. So, you may answer these and say, hey, I've never used Landfire data, and that's okay. It's all about the learning, the path of knowledge.
Okay, getting lots of responses in. Just take another 20 seconds.
While we're waiting, Henry, there's been some interest in that paper that you referenced. So.
Yeah, I see Jessica's got her question saying, please send us the link. So we'll definitely do that.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I'll end that, and here's the results.
So again, a large group of you've never used Landfire data, and that's okay. You know, that's what I said. It's all about the journey, learning. That's why we come to these webinars, to be exposed to things that maybe we're just not that familiar with. Number of you, though, have visited the website, which is great, and a mix, you know, about equal there on whether you've recommended it or not. That's excellent. All right. So looking at the clock, we've got a few more. I'm going to run through these slides, and then I think we'll just take some questions here at the end. As all good projects, you know, it's one thing to generate something and get it out there. We've also, you know, heard pretty loud and clear from our users that, hey, you know, you need to make some improvements here and there. So to help facilitate user feedback, we created this data product review website. There's the URL to it. But it's in a GIS form where it pulls up both vegetation as well as fire behavior and guides the user through some drop-down menus to say, hey, you know, how are the products here? And of course, we welcome both good as well as bad. Good feedback is really important to say, hey, you got it right. You know, that's, you know, we like to hear that, and that helps us further refine our modeling processes to make sure that we continue to, you know, map it correctly. And then, of course, most people are in that camp of, hey, you messed up over here. You got this wrong. And that's where we give people an opportunity to go through in a GIS online format and be able to make some changes. So I'm going to quickly show you some examples of this. This is from Utah. But this just shows you how to populate the form. Some of this is already auto-populated based on the location that you may have selected, you know, on the map as you pull it up in the website. And then you can go through and fill out a few of these drop-down menus. If you're looking at, you know, this particular instance is the fire behavior product. So if you're familiar with that, you'll put your information in. Many people are probably all familiar with vegetation, so you're going to make more comments on that. And then, of course, just an open comment field that we highly suggest that, you know, people spend a little bit of time talking about, well, why didn't this work well for you, or what worked well, so that we have a sense of, you know, where do we maybe in the future may need to make a change with these products. And people can upload files with that. We've actually had a number of people do that so far. And looking again at the Utah example, they have a wildland fire risk assessment portal, also known as RAP, but they highlighted some concerns with the data. This was particularly some non-burnable field models. Of course, they were using an earlier version of Landfire, and of course, Landfire's, you know, updating every 2 years with our biennial updates. That we've actually addressed a number of these, but it's helpful for folks to, you know, pull this together. They looked across the entire state and said, you know, here in these red dots are areas that we feel, you know, did not correctly deal with the non-burnable vegetation types. So, you know, help us out. So we're working with them right now on that, and that'll be part of the future of what we deliver with the products. To drill down into that, just to give you a little bit more close view of some of the things they highlighted. So, you know, here on the left is the imagery. You can see a lot of developed non-burnable there, you know, with businesses and things like that. So you see that in the Landfire EVT as well as the fire behavior field model with the 40. We've got some of those natural veg you can see up here on the upper, you know, top of the red that are still burnable, and then this non-burnable here, you know, where it's of course developed. And the way we do that is we go through this kind of user and data discrepancy. We'll get your comments. It'll come through that submission. We kind of rank and assign that based on, again, the geographic priority, our ability to deal with that production standpoint. If it's something that is broad and wide scale, that's going to definitely raise its ranking to the top. So we go through that type of a sorting of feedback to help us determine, okay, what do we deal with first? What's going to have the biggest impact for users across the country as we look at that? there may be some things, this is that last bullet, that it'll be a great question to come in and say, hey, what about this? And a good example is from our friends up in the north central states that have said, hey, we really need some subsurface fire behavior models, particularly when we look at, peat bogs and some of those types of landscapes. Well, there just hasn't been a lot of science on subsurface, fire and spread of fire in those types of systems. So that could be a science and research that we're going to have to kick that off and say, hey, science, can you help us out in developing something like that? But ultimately, that will go through this prioritization to get us to what we will eventually use as either updates or, help improve that data for the future. So it's time for another poll. So this will be, I think, our last poll, Mark. All right. So looks like relax and unwind. What is that? Okay, we've got a problem, America. Yeah, it's a little bit all over the board. That's good. So moving on, this gets to our last slide. Landfire in the future. It's a lot about you. I talked about at the beginning of being able to have these partnerships and collaboration. We really rely on those partnerships to make Landfire successful. It's not just we can't go out and just do this by ourselves. But these data are foundational. They really are helping improve landscape decisions. And if you haven't, which we saw through the poll results, it's like some of you haven't used the data. So just encourage you to take a look at it. If you need help, we've got some folks that can provide some assistance in addressing some questions with you to say, well, what about this? We'd be happy to do that. Just use the contact us link, the find help there at landfire.gov, and you'll be able to get some support that way. And we'll also, send you off to some other publications on how to modify Landfire and, things like that to make it better so it can work for you. So with that, really appreciate USU and Mark and Megan for pulling all this together and making time to make this happen today.
Henry, it was great having you. I did see one question from Carl. Will this connect with USGS water resource data? That was up in the chat, so just found it.
Okay. Could we get someone maybe to elaborate on that? When they say USGS water data, is that just looking at stream flows or?
Carl, if you want to clarify your question and just, Carl Dupolt, clarify your question maybe, and stream flows, he said.
And then while he's getting ready to do that, we'll go to Glenn's question next on insects and disease.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, we'll go to Glenn's question first while Carl's thinking about the USGS water. So Glenn asked the question, how much data is gathered from insect infestations such as mountain pine beetle population bursts? And so Landfire has been looking at a number of disturbance types, including fire, mechanical treatments, could be timber harvest. We also include insect and disease. We'll also include wind event, weather type damage in the data products. And the forest and health data that we've been using is through the Forest Services Forest Health Enterprise Technology team out of Colorado. So we realize that data, like all things, you have to understand how it's created, how it's generated. There's a lot of that was done by aerial, flights. So some of those polygons are pretty good and definitive, and we've been able to use that data in helping, update the Landfire products based on where those insect and disease infestations occur. So you will see that in the data products that Landfire produces. So we'll produce an updated veg cover and height, as well as fire behavior products based on that. We know that Forest Service is working on improving their way that they're categorizing those insect and disease, so we're hopeful for what that's going to bring in the future. And then through, I'll just say USGS, Forest Service, there's some collaborative effort going on right now to look at what I'll call larger landscape change. USGS has got a project called LCMAP, which is the Landscape Change Assessment, Monitoring, and Projection program. And with that, they're looking at the Landsat archive to see if they can detect where insect changes, may be affecting the landscape. before you actually see it, manifest itself in the vegetation. And they've found that they're able to look at the spectral signatures of the, let's say, a forest stand to see that something's going on. That stand just isn't as healthy as neighboring stands. And fast forward a year, 2 years, you will then see that, that spectral signature has changed, has resulted in this change where insects have actually, impacted that stand. So we are using that data, and it's helping inform what we're updating. That's probably a little bit more than maybe you wanted to know, Glenn. But if there's more, we can definitely do that. So back to Carl.
Let me interrupt you for a quick second. Before we lose too many of our attendees, I'm going to ask Mark to launch our evaluation poll. If folks could just take that really quickly, that would help us do our job better.
Yep.
And if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A chat pod, and we will get to them. We still have about 7 minutes left.
Perfect. So while you guys are filling out that poll, we'll go to Carl's question. He says, stream flow data and quantities of water available to fight fires. So I'd say we probably are not fully utilizing that like we may need to. We've done some where there's what I'll call persistent bodies of water. There's been some studies done looking at what is available for like the national wetlands and riparian rivers, reservoirs, lakes data set, where they have taken that data and done an assessment to look at scoopers, for instance, that they could then bring an airplane in and scoop water up relative to those locations where those persistent bodies of waters are located and the associated environment where fire and fire risk occurs. But beyond that, we haven't drilled down into that to think about, well, okay, this year it's a drought year. Well, what effect might that have, on that? So I think it's a good question, Carl, and something that we probably just ought to put in the queue and think about, well, how can we maybe deal with that in the future?
Awesome, Henry. I'm not seeing any more questions. Let me just address the question that I get every time. Is this webinar recorded? Where is it going to be available? We have a website where all of our webinars are stored. So I'm just going to put that in the chat pod right now. And then there will also be, it'll also be listed on the Learn extension website. So I will have that in another email as well. So a lot of people often ask me that question, and I just like to make sure everybody knows that we do record these for everybody that is everybody that's working in the field today or is homesick or whatever. And if we don't have any more questions, I'm just going to give it one more second here, unless you can think of anything you might want to address, Henry.
Well, I purposefully, I'll throw this one in. You probably caught me when you think about, one of the questions in the poll was, should Landfire be supported? And, I think knowledge of these data are sometimes lacking where it is data behind the scenes. But these types of data are very important, in thinking about the foundation. So I didn't key in on that question, the result when Mark threw up the results, but it was impressive to me to think, yeah, these types of data are important. I will say that I think we can do a better job. As you've seen in my earlier comments about the memorandum of understanding that we did with GAP and Landfire, I think we've got to, do a better job of working together where there's other mapping efforts, doing things. We can't afford, you see what's happening in the government now. Of course, maybe it's just a phase of what's going on, but I don't think we can afford to spend money on duplicative efforts. So if there's a way that we can, pull those things together, improve the quality, and then we can get back to, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but, what about driving down to my local tracks? I think in the future, as remote sensing improves, our ability to do that with LiDAR and other data sets coming online, the quality of those products are going to improve to the point that we all need to pull those things together. So I think with that, to me, that's the real future of where Landfire needs to go. Granted, we're taking some baby steps. We did the updates. That was great. Now we're working on a remap. That's awesome. Next, but where do you need to go next? Well, we need to think bigger than just updating a map.
There's one question in the Q&A from Gail.
Oh, so Gail, what is the quickest way? So We do have data. There's data is available through ArcGIS Online. We actually didn't talk that much about this. Where can you get the data? So ArcGIS Online, you can access it there through Landfire. You can also get the data, as you can see in my circle here. That provides a link to a data distribution site where you can go in and click on an area of interest and pull down that data. Landfire has developed mosaics, so if you're interested in pulling down an entire mosaic across the country of, say, veg cover, because you're interested in cover for whatever reason, you're able to go pull it down that way. So great question, Gail.
I'm not seeing any other questions. I guess you did an amazing job answering everybody's questions throughout the webinar. Henry, are you okay with me sharing your email if people come at me with some questions that I can't answer?
You bet.
Okay.
Always happy to visit with folks.
Great. Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, audience, for tuning in today. Please remember to take that poll. Keep your eye out for an email from me, and we will have some links to we'll have a link to the paper that Henry referenced and some other of the key links that he offered throughout his presentation today that will be helpful as the many of you start to explore Landfire. And as we see, there's a lot of research that's could be definitely enhanced by Landfire, because a lot of our users have not delved into it yet. So thank you for a great presentation, Henry.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.